for academic purposes students have quite a challenge ahead of them. Not only do they need to learn the English language to quite a high level of language proficiency, including complex vocabulary and complex grammar, they also need to learn different ways of thinking that will enable them to be successful in a higher education setting in an English-speaking context. In this session, we're going to look at one of these ways of thinking that we need to teach our English for academic purposes students, and that is critical thinking. We'll define the concept, we'll also explore some of the cultural assumptions behind the concept, and then we'll take a look at different ways to teach our students critical thinking so that they can be successful with their higher education studies in English. We'll start by defining critical thinking because there are different ways to actually define the concept. Then we'll take a look at the cultural assumptions that lie behind the value that we place on critical thinking in English-speaking cultures. Then we'll start to pull critical thinking apart using different frameworks. So these frameworks include Bloom's taxonomy, different structures of arguments, different types of reasoning, and different subskills that go along with critical thinking. Then we'll also take a look at the language, or the English language, that goes with critical thinking. Finally, we'll take a look at activities to use with your students to ensure that they learn critical thinking skills. And we'll wrap up just with a really quick look at additional resources that you can use to expand your knowledge of critical thinking. Critical thinking is one of those concepts that's really challenging to define. There is no single definition of critical thinking out there that captures all of the intricacies that go with the concept. So we're going to take a look at a variety of definitions and pull out key points from each definition. Here's the first definition. Critical thinking is disciplined thinking that is clear, rational, open-minded, and informed by evidence. This definition is just a standard dictionary definition. There are two key points to pull out from this first definition of critical thinking. The first is that critical thinking is rational, so it is logical and it's very objective. And the second key point is that critical thinking is evidence-based. So we don't come up with our conclusions in critical thinking using our imagination or any other type of creativity. It is very, very evidence-based, based on what's happening and what we see in the real world. Here's another definition that comes to us from John Dewey way back in 1909. Critical thinking is active, persistent, and careful consideration of a belief or supposed form of knowledge in the light of the grounds which support it and the further conclusions to which it tends. A key point to pull out from the second definition of critical thinking is that it's active, or it's an active process, as opposed to being a passive process. So when we think critically, we are actively engaging our brains to process the information and decide if we're going to believe this information or not. Here's a definition that comes from a current and core textbook on critical thinking. Critical thinking is the systematic evaluation or formulation of beliefs or statements by rational standards. In the third definition of critical thinking, we're going to focus on the point that critical thinking is systematic. So when we're thinking critically, we're following very clear steps or a very clear process. And we'll look at what some of these processes are further into this session. Back in 1941, Edward Glasser came up with this definition. Critical thinking is 1, an attitude of being disposed to consider in a thoughtful way the problems and subjects that come with the range of one's experience. 2, knowledge of the methods of logical inquiry and reasoning. And 3, some skill in applying those methods. From the fourth definition, we're going to focus on the fact that critical thinking has 3 layers to it. So it has an attitudinal layer, so you have to be open-minded and willing to think critically. Then it has a knowledge layer, so you have to understand the concepts of critical thinking in order to be able to do it. And then finally, it has a skill layer, so not only do you need to know about critical thinking, you actually have to be able to use it. A more current definition from 1989 is critical thinking is reasonable, reflective thinking that is focused on deciding what to believe or do. In the fifth definition, we're going to focus on the word reflective. Critical thinking is a reflective process in that it, first of all, is internal, and secondly, it's a process that we engage upon in which we go back and rethink what we previously thought. So it's very much this intellectual, reflective process. And finally, a definition from 1993, critical thinking is that mode of thinking about any subject, content, or problem in which the thinker improves the quality of his or her thinking by skillfully taking charge of the structures inherent in thinking and imposing intellectual standards upon them. In the final definition, a key idea is that as human beings, we can take charge of our own thinking through critical thinking. So with critical thinking, no one's telling us what to think. We're figuring it out for ourselves using this systematic process. If we pull all of these ideas together, we get the bubble diagram that we've given you in Activity 1. So critical thinking is active, it's systematic, it's rational, it's evaluative, it's evidence-based, and it's a system over which we have personal control, it's reflective, and it has those 3 layers of attitude, knowledge, and skills. Critical thinking really pinpoints a key cultural difference, and that is a difference in belief about how we learn as human beings. If we were to put these differences on a continuum with 2 opposite ideas at each end of the continuum, on one side we would have the belief that human beings learn by passive transmission of knowledge. So as an expert, I have knowledge, and then I give it to you as a non-expert, and you take that knowledge and now you've learned. On the other end of the continuum is the belief that human beings actively and individually construct their own knowledge based on both knowledge people give them, but also on their own personal experiences. And they construct this knowledge critically. This is called constructivism. And this is a key belief in English-speaking cultures, and it's particularly evident at the higher education sector. In cultures in which there's the belief that learning takes place through the passive transmission of knowledge, the education system is fact-based and non-critical. And students take part in activities such as rote memorization, description, and narration. So there's no critical component going on in these education systems. At the other end of the continuum, in education systems based on constructivism, the instructional process is very critical, almost to the point of being adversarial. So there's this back and forth discussion between the teachers and the students about the knowledge that's being considered. So instructional activities here include problem solving, critical thinking, discovery, and any type of discussion or debate that puts the knowledge under the microscope and evaluates it. For our English for Academic Purposes students who come from a culture where the education system is based on this idea of passive transmission of knowledge, making the leap to constructivism and more specifically critical thinking is really, really challenging. We can't just tell our students, okay, think critically about this article. What we have to do, first of all, is explicitly explain the concept, then we have to break it down, and we have to give them activities so they can approach critical thinking incrementally. So that's one of the things we'll look at in this session. How do we bridge that cultural gap for our students? A useful framework for making constructivism and critical thinking explicit for our EAP students is Bloom's taxonomy. Bloom's taxonomy takes the learning process and divides it into 6 levels. And as you go down each level, the thinking required becomes more and more complex. Students who come from a culture based on passive transmission of knowledge will be comfortable at the first 2 levels of Bloom's taxonomy, but they'll be very uncomfortable and unskilled at the subsequent levels where the thinking becomes more critical and more evaluative. Let's take a look at each level of Bloom's taxonomy in a bit more detail. So I'll give you the level, a brief description of the level, and then example tasks that we might give students so that they can think at this level of the taxonomy. The first level is knowledge. At this level, students recall data or information. So tasks that we might give students at this level include define, label, recall, list, identify, describe, and state. The second level is comprehension. At this level, students understand the meaning and interpretation of instructions and problems. They're able to state a problem in their own words to demonstrate that they've understood it. Task types that we can give students at this level include interpret, paraphrase, modify, and explain. The third level, and this is where we're getting into territory that might be new for some of our EAP students, is application. At this level, students use a concept in a new situation. They apply what was learned in the classroom to these new situations. Tasks that we might give students at this level include compute, apply, demonstrate, and generate. The next level is analysis. At this level, students separate concepts into their component parts so that they can understand the organizational structure. Task types at this level include analyze, categorize, relate, and differentiate. The fifth level is synthesis. At this level, students build a structure or pattern from different pieces or elements. So they put parts together to form a whole with an emphasis on creating a new meaning or a new structure from those parts. Tasks that we can give students at this level include create, combine, reconstruct, summarize, revise, modify, and design. The sixth and final level of Bloom's taxonomy is evaluation. At this level, students make judgments about the value of ideas or situations. So tasks that we can give them here include compare, evaluate, critique, support, conclude, justify, discriminate, contrast, and defend. One of the things we can do to help our students complete critical thinking tasks is to make them aware of the level at which this particular task falls in terms of Bloom's taxonomy. So for example, if I have them design something, then I point out, or I get them to point out, that this falls at the synthesis level. If I'm asking them to critique something, we talk about the fact that this is at the evaluation or the highest level of Bloom's taxonomy. So just make it really obvious for your students the level of thinking at which they need to operate to complete a task. With Bloom's taxonomy, we can make our EAP students aware that different tasks require different levels of thinking. And in order to think at these different levels, so the different levels of the taxonomy, students need to draw upon different types of thinking skills. They may not have those thinking skills, so they have to develop them. Another way to help our students simply understand the idea of critical thinking and the skills involved in critical thinking is to walk them through different structures of arguments. So they may not be familiar, first of all, with how we structure a general argument, and secondly, with how we structure different types of arguments. So we make this explicit and obvious to our students. An easy way to make argument structure obvious for our EAP students is to diagram them. So we can make diagrams of the argument structure that start with the statement or the position that we're making, and then the diagram shows how the different supporting points in turn make that argument rational and valid. Let's take a look at some of the simpler argument structures that we can put into diagrams. The simplest argument structure that we can diagram for students is one with a single statement or position and then multiple equally important supporting points. The next argument structure has a statement or position which is first supported by a general point, and then subsequent points become more and more specific. And the final point is the most specific point of all, or the most detailed point of all. The next argument structure has a statement or position, and it's supported by points of decreasing levels of importance. So the first point is the most important, the next point is less important, and the very last point is the least important. The next argument structure introduces both supporting points for the statement and opposing points. So the structure starts with the statement or position once again, followed by the points that support that position. This is then followed by points that oppose the position and rebuttals of those opposing points. And it concludes with a restatement of the supporting points. The next argument structure has a statement or position supported by two main points, and then those main points are in turn supported by smaller points. So we start to get a hierarchy or a pyramid structure going. This is just a sample of the argument structures that we want to teach our EAP students. For more complex argument structures to teach higher level EAP students, take a look at some of the resources provided at the end of your handout. These resources take you through these more complicated argument structures, and they also have good diagrams of the structures. There are now software tools available to help students, and you as the teacher in fact, diagram out the structures of arguments. These tools allow you to create really good visual representations of the arguments you're making so that then you can verify the structure and the argument. Take a look at your handout for two samples of this type of software. Another approach we can take when we're trying to make critical thinking explicit and obvious for our EAP students is to take them through different types of reasoning. So not argument structure, but reasoning or thinking. The two main types of reasoning that students need to know are deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning is also known as top-down reasoning. In deductive reasoning, we start with general statements that are true, and from those general statements, we then conclude that a more specific statement is also true. As long as those general statements are actually true and our reasoning is logical, then we're very confident that our concluding statement, our very specific statement, is true also. Here's a very simple example of deductive reasoning. So my first general statement is that human beings have a heart. My second general statement is that you are a human being. My specific statement, therefore, is that you have a heart. Inductive reasoning is also known as bottom-up reasoning. With inductive reasoning, we start with specific examples and then we draw a general conclusion. That conclusion is probably true, but it may also not be true. With inductive reasoning, we can't always say with 100% certainty that our conclusion is true. We can simply say it is either strong or weak, depending upon the probability of that truthfulness. Here's a very simple example of inductive reasoning. My first specific example is, John is a basketball player and he is very tall. My second specific example is, Mark is a basketball player and he is also very tall. My general conclusion then is that basketball players are very tall. This is a fairly strong inductive reasoning argument, but it's not 100% true all the time. We can further break both deductive and inductive reasoning into subcategories, so there are more detailed types of deductive and inductive reasoning. These types are beyond the scope of this session. If you want to dig more deeply into deductive and inductive reasoning, take a look at the additional resources we've given at the end of the session. We don't just have to teach our students types of effective reasoning, so deductive and inductive reasoning. We also have to teach them flawed reasoning, which obviously we want them to avoid. Here are some examples of flawed reasoning that we might want to teach our EAP students. A contradiction is reasoning in which two opposite points are claimed to be true, but it is not logical for these 2 points to actually be true at the same time. A circular argument is flawed reasoning in which the conclusion is also one of the supporting points. So in other words, in a circular argument, a conclusion is used to support itself. A false analogy is flawed reasoning in which an analogy is used that is illogical. An analogy is when 2 objects are considered to be similar and they share similar properties. So they're used to support an argument because of the similarities of these properties. A false analogy is when 2 objects appear to be similar, but they're actually different with respect to the particular property being used in the reasoning. An illogical conclusion is false reasoning that is simply not logical. If I try to make my conclusion based on the point that 2 plus 2 equals 5, I have an illogical conclusion because mathematically we know 2 plus 2 equals 4. When we're working with our students on their critical thinking, we need to give them practice in both deductive and inductive reasoning. We also need to give them practice at identifying flawed reasoning. So with this work, students will always know what type of reasoning they're using, and they'll know if their reasoning is effective or not. A final framework to use with our students to help them develop their critical thinking is to take the overall skill of critical thinking and divide it into subskills. So we're breaking the skills down into manageable chunks, and our students can learn each of the subskills and then put them together to have good overall critical thinking. These subskills can first be divided into subskills for listening and reading, and then subskills for speaking and writing. The receptive critical thinking subskills, so the skills for when students are listening and reading, are as follows. Identify the author's position, evaluation, or judgment. Identify the supporting details or reasons for that position. Identify the structure of the argument the author is making. Identify the type of reasoning the author is using. Identify the types of supporting details. So are they direct support, opposing arguments, rebuttal of opposing arguments? Distinguish fact and opinion. Distinguish qualitative and quantitative supporting details. Identify implied versus explicitly stated points. Identify and evaluate hidden assumptions, premises, biases, and appeals to emotion. Evaluate the author's argument as true or false, or strong or weak. Identify the flaws in the author's argument, including contradictions, circular arguments, false analogies, and illogical conclusions. Here are the productive critical thinking subskills that our students need. So these are the skills for speaking and writing. Clearly state a position, evaluation, or judgment. Support a position, evaluation, or judgment with details, examples, or research. Have a clear argument structure. Have an evident type of reasoning. Have clear types of supporting details, so direct support, opposing arguments, rebuttal of opposing arguments. Have both qualitative and quantitative details, if applicable. Avoid assumptions, premises, biases, and appeals to emotion. Avoid flawed reasoning, such as contradictions, circular arguments, false analogies, and illogical conclusions. Connect ideas so that the argument flows smoothly. A final piece that we need to give our students, not so they can think critically, but so that they can communicate their critical thinking, is the language that goes with critical thinking. We call this language indicators. Indicators are words or phrases that tell the listener or reader what they're about to listen to or read. We can divide these indicators for critical thinking into 3 main categories. We have the indicators for the statement or position. We have the indicators for the supporting points, and we have the indicators for the conclusions. Statement or position indicators include my position is, my point is, I believe that, it is my belief that, I contend that, I put forward that, and it is thought that. This list is by no means complete, but it's a good starting point. Reason or supporting point indicators include because, since, for, first, second, third, then, next, finally, or the phrase my first point is, my second point is, and my third point is. Examples of conclusion indicators are therefore, so, hence, thus, consequently, which proves that, which demonstrates that, we can conclude that, the conclusion is, from which we can conclude, it follows that, or such and such demonstrates that. When we teach critical thinking to our students, it's important that we give them this language for critical thinking, so these indicators, so that they can effectively communicate both their critical thinking and their reasoning to their listeners and their readers. Now that we've looked at different frameworks with which to make critical thinking explicit to our students, it's time to take a look at how we actually teach critical thinking. There are 4 key things to keep in mind overall when you're teaching critical thinking to your students. First, critical thinking should be taught at all language proficiency levels. Don't just teach it at the advanced levels. At the lower language proficiency levels, your vocabulary and your concepts and your grammatical structures are simpler, and you're just going to teach the very basic critical thinking skills. And then as students get better and get more advanced, you're going to increase the complexity of the concepts, increase the complexity of the vocabulary and the grammar, and also increase the critical thinking demands that you place on them. But regardless of language proficiency level, students need to be introduced to critical thinking skills, and they need the opportunities to practice those skills. Second, critical thinking should be taught incrementally. So you're going to just gradually expand the skill set that students have with the overall skill of critical thinking. So introduce some of the subskills and then add more subskills and more subskills. Introduce one type of reasoning, add the next type of reasoning, and so on. So approach it incrementally. Third, give students a lot, and I do mean a lot, of opportunity to practice critical thinking. Don't just explain it or give them the frameworks. Make sure they have the opportunity to put these skills and put these frameworks into practice. The more they practice, the better they'll be. And finally, use concrete examples and diagrams and illustrations wherever possible. The more support you can give students as they try to master critical thinking, the better. Let's take a look at specific activities that we can use to teach our students critical thinking skills. We'll start with activities for the receptive skills, so listening and reading, and then we'll look at activities for the productive skills, speaking and writing. Give students a series of statements. Students have to work either individually or in pairs to determine which statements are positions, so which are your arguments, and then which statements are supporting points or supporting details. Give students a series of statements once again. This time, however, they're distinguishing between statements that are fact and statements that are opinion. Give students a series of statements that are supporting details for an argument, and tell them what the argument or position is first. Students then have to determine which of the statements are direct supporting points, which are actually opposing arguments, and which are rebuttals of the opposing arguments. Students read a short text and identify what the author's voice, viewpoint, and biases are. So they're trying to determine the author's perspective in this text. Give students a short text that contains a clear argument. Have students work individually or in pairs to create a diagram similar to the ones presented earlier that illustrates the argument and the structure of the argument. Give students a series of short texts, each of which contains a single argument. Have students read each text and determine whether the reasoning in each of the arguments is deductive or inductive. Have students quickly scan a longer academic argument, and they are scanning to identify which supporting details are qualitative and which supporting details are quantitative. Have students read a series of short texts and have them identify any flawed reasoning within those short texts. Have students read an academic article, and it can either be long or short depending on the language proficiency level of the students. As they read, have them identify the supporting points and the types of reasoning, and have them apply more than one of the subskills to critical thinking that we've presented. At the end of reading, students need to decide whether this is a good argument or a not so good argument, and why. Now let's take a look at productive critical thinking activities that we can do with our students. So these are activities for speaking and writing. Put a series of simple position or argument statements on the board, and they can be about any topic. Students work individually to write 2 or 3 supporting details to support those argument or position statements. Have students write 3 sentences that demonstrate deductive reasoning on a topic that you give them, and keep the topic simple. And then have students write 3 sentences that demonstrate inductive reasoning on the same topic or a different topic. Have students write 6 sentences, 3 of which are facts and 3 of which are opinions. You can either leave the topic up to them or you can provide the topic in advance. Students work with a reading text that has flawed reasoning in it, and then they work to correct that flawed reasoning. And they rewrite the text with the corrected reasoning in it. Give students an argument structure and a topic. Have them first of all create an argument diagram for that topic with their position statement and their supporting details. Then have them pull all of that together into a simple paragraph that argues their position. Have students create an argument structure diagram on a topic you provide, and this time they're going to create a debate and actually enact the debate based once again on the argument structure diagram that they've created. Finally, you can have students complete lengthier works, either in speaking or writing, that pull together multiple frameworks or multiple subskills that we've looked at. For example, for lower level students, you can have them write a single paragraph that makes a particular argument and uses a particular structure. For intermediate students, you can have them write, for example, a 3-paragraph essay. And for higher level students, you can have them write a multi-page essay. Similarly, you can have students do short presentations that demonstrate their position and their argumentation on different topics. There are a lot of activities that you can use with your students, both for receptive skills and productive skills, to help them both learn critical thinking and apply critical thinking to their academic work. We have only really touched the surface of the concept of critical thinking and how to teach critical thinking to our students. If you want to dig more deeply into critical thinking, take a look at the additional resources we've provided under Activity 9 in your handout. Critical thinking is an essential skill for English for academic purposes students in English-speaking settings for higher education. They simply will not be successful if they don't have these critical thinking skills. And this is true regardless of the field of study that the students are going into. Work with your students on these critical thinking skills using the frameworks and the activities we've presented. You'll find it very rewarding as you see the progress that your students make in the development of their critical thinking skills.